My twin sister came to visit me in the hospital with bruises covering her arms from her wrists to her elbows. When I saw what had been done to her, I made a decision. I was going to trade lives with her, walk into that house as her, and make sure the people inside understood what they had done. My name is Nora. I have been a patient at Lakeview Behavioral Health Center for 10 years. And what happened next is something I have never told anyone until now. We are identical twins, Claire and I, same face, same hands, same way of going still when something frightens us. The difference is that she went home after high school and I came here, and for 10 years the world outside these walls kept moving without me. Lakeview is not what you picture when you hear the word institution. There are no screaming hallways, no one strapped to a gurney. It is mostly just white walls, white floors, the particular white of a place that gets cleaned every day by people who are paid not to notice what they're cleaning around. My room is small enough that I can cross it in 4 steps. The window has a steel bar across the middle bolted into the frame on both sides. For 10 years I have used that bar to do pull-ups every morning, sets of 20, then rest, then 20 more until my arms gave out, and then until they stopped giving out. The staff used to watch me do it like it made them uneasy. After a while they stopped watching. I got here at 16. A boy from the neighborhood grabbed Claire by the hair in an alley behind the laundromat on Crane Street and tried to drag her somewhere darker. She was crying. She didn't fight back. That was never something Claire knew how to do. I was the one who found them, and I did what made sense to me in that moment, which was to put him on the ground and make sure he stayed there. I broke his arm. The crowd that gathered didn't look at him. They looked at me. My parents were already exhausted people, and what they saw on my face that afternoon was the thing that finally broke them. They signed the papers 6 weeks later. I was committed under an emergency psychiatric hold, and what followed was not simple. The evaluating psychiatrist added a second diagnosis to my file within the first year: severe impulse dysregulation with dissociative features, language clinical enough to sound permanent. My parents never contested it. They were tired and frightened, and I think some part of them believed the diagnosis made the decision they had already made easier to live with. By the time I turned 18, the hold had converted to a long-term civil commitment, and no one came to reverse it because no one tried. The file said I was dangerous. The file was the only version of me most people ever read. I don't tell that story with regret. I tell it the same way every time because it is what happened, and because changing the way I say it would be the same as lying. The boy grabbed my sister. I stopped him. Everything after that is just what the world decided to do with me. I know what you're thinking right now. And you're not wrong. The one thing that hurt, the only thing in 10 years of white walls and controlled mealtimes and medication adjustments, was not knowing what was happening to Claire. She visited every month. She always brought something: a bag of oranges, a box of crackers, something she'd picked out carefully with the little money she had. She always smiled. I knew the smile. It was the smile she used when she needed the room to believe she was fine. Today is visiting day. I have been awake since 5 in the morning, lying on top of the covers watching the light change on the ceiling. There is a low pressure behind my sternum that I cannot name. I know she is coming. I also know, without being able to say how, that something is different today. Standing at my window at 7:15 watching the parking lot fill up one car at a time, I am not sure this feeling is going to be wrong. The visiting room at Lakeview has 1 table, 2 chairs, and a window with wire running through the glass in a grid pattern. There is a wall-mounted camera in the upper corner that nobody mentions. The room smells like the rest of the building: disinfectant and recycled air, but with something underneath it, something brought in from outside that changes depending on who's visiting. Perfume sometimes. Fast food. Rain on a coat. Claire came through the door at 9:10, and I knew before she reached the table. It wasn't one thing. It was the long sleeves, a dark cotton shirt buttoned to the collar in the middle of July. It was the weight she'd lost since last month visible in her jaw, in the way her collar sat too wide. It was the fruit basket she was holding against her chest like a shield, her fingers wrapped around the handle too tight. She smiled at me. It was the smile I knew. I smiled back and said nothing and waited for her to sit down. I let her talk for a few minutes. She asked how I was sleeping. She mentioned Avery had started saying full sentences. She said Kyle had put in for overtime. Her voice was careful, in the way a person's voice gets when they've practiced keeping it that way. I watched her hands on the table. The knuckles on her right hand were swollen. The nails were bitten down past the quick. I reached across and touched the bruise under her left cheekbone. She jerked back from my hand before she could stop herself. A fast involuntary pull, the way you move from heat. She laughed it off immediately. Said she'd walked into a cabinet door in the dark. Said it looked worse than it was. I didn't argue with her. I just reached for her wrist. She made a sound I hadn't heard from her before, a short, sharp intake of breath, more surprise than pain. She tried to pull away. I held on and I pushed the sleeve up to her elbow. I want you to sit with what I saw for a second. Because I need you to understand that I am not someone who scares easily, and what was on my sister's arms scared me. The bruises went from her wrist to the inside of her elbow, old ones that had turned that greenish yellow, newer ones still purple dark at the center. There were marks that were clearly from fingers, the oval impressions of a grip applied hard enough to leave a record. There were 2 thin lines across the forearm, slightly raised, the kind of mark a belt edge leaves when it lands at an angle. I looked at it the way you look at something you already knew was there. Then I let go of her wrist and sat back. She didn't try to explain it this time. Whatever she'd been holding in place finally gave, and she slid off the chair and down to the floor and grabbed onto my legs and started crying, not the quiet kind. The kind that had been stored somewhere for a long time and didn't have a shape anymore by the time it came out. She told me about Kyle. About how it started 6 months into the marriage and what it looked like now 7 years later. She told me about Marlene, his mother, who owned the house and ran it and had treated Claire like a problem that needed to be managed from the day she moved in. She told me about Deborah, Kyle's sister, who'd moved back in after her divorce with her 5-year-old son Mason. And how Mason had learned from watching the adults what you were allowed to do to people who couldn't stop you. She told me all of it, and I sat and listened and did not say one word, because I understood that this was not a conversation. This was a confession. This was my sister finally putting it down in front of someone who would not look away. And then she told me about 2 nights ago. Kyle came home from the casino after midnight, drunk and already angry, before he walked through the door. Avery was still up crying. She was 3 years old and she was crying, which is something 3-year-olds do. He told her to stop. She didn't stop. He hit her across the face with an open hand. Claire said it in one sentence, looking at the floor. I stopped hearing the rest of what she said after that. Not because I stopped listening. Because there was nothing else that mattered. I lifted Claire off the floor and sat her on the chair and put the fruit basket on the table between us and said, "You didn't come here to visit me today. You came here to trade." She stared at me. Then she started shaking her head, and once she started she couldn't seem to stop. She said I didn't understand what that house was. She said the people in it were not people I was equipped to handle, that 10 years inside had changed me, that I wouldn't know how to move through the world out there anymore. She said it the way people say things when they are trying to protect you and also terrifying themselves in the process. I let her finish. Then I pointed at the window with the bar bolted across the middle of it. I said I have spent 10 years living 20 feet from people who hurt other people for reasons that made no sense and couldn't be argued with. The only difference between them and the people in your house is that the ones in here have a diagnosis. So do I, for that matter. I am not worried about surviving out there. I am worried about what happens to Avery if I don't go. That landed. I watched it land. I told her the rules quickly because the visit timer was already running down. She would stay. She would answer to my name. She didn't need to talk. The staff were long accustomed to me going through stretches of near silence, and they'd read it as a good day, a calm day. She could nod or shake her head if someone asked her something directly. She should eat, sleep, stay in the room. There were 2 shelves of books I'd read over the years. She could start anywhere. Nobody would bother her. She opened her mouth. I talked over her. I told her to take off her shirt. We switched clothes in the corner of the room, moving fast and not looking at each other the way you don't look at someone when the thing you're doing is too serious for eye contact. I put on her clothes, a dark cotton shirt that smelled like her house, like something I couldn't name yet but would come to know very well. She put on my Lakeview shirt, the plain gray one, and immediately looked smaller in it. I took her ID from her jacket pocket. I took her house keys. I took the envelope she'd brought tucked under the fruit, the one she hadn't mentioned and hadn't needed, to the one I'd felt the weight of when she set the basket down. Medical records, dates and injuries going back years. I didn't look at them yet. I put them in the jacket pocket and zipped it. The buzzer sounded from the hallway. End of visiting hours. Claire grabbed my hand. She didn't say anything. I squeezed once and let go. I walked to the door. The floor nurse at the station looked up from her clipboard, a woman named Patrice who had worked this ward for at least 6 of my 10 years and knew both of us by sight. She said, "Take care, hon. Drive safe." She was talking to me as Claire. I gave her the smile I'd watched Claire use for years, small, a little tired, grateful for the dismissal. Patrice was already looking back at her clipboard before I made it to the exit door. The door opened outward. July heat came through it like a wall, thick, heavy tasting of exhaust and hot concrete and the particular smell of a city in summer. I stood in it for a moment. 10 years. I had not felt outdoor air in 10 years. I walked to the sidewalk, turned left toward the bus stop and said 3 names quietly to myself so I would have them ready. Kyle. Marlene. Deborah. The bus came 8 minutes later. I got on and did not look back. Claire's address was a row house on a block where every house looked like it had been leaning against the next one for so long neither one remembered how to stand alone. I found it the way she'd described, third from the corner, green door, a crack running up the front step that nobody had filled in. The bus had let me off 4 blocks away. I walked the rest. The key turned on the second try. I pushed the door open and stood in the entrance for a moment before I went in. The smell hit first. Grease and something sour underneath it, the smell of a house where the windows didn't get opened and the dishes waited until someone decided they felt like it. There were plates on the table from what looked like lunch, dried food on the rims, a fork left in a pot. The floor had that slightly sticky quality that comes from being mopped infrequently with dirty water. I had lived in a psychiatric facility for 10 years and I had seen cleaner common rooms. Then I saw Avery. She was in the far corner of the front room, sitting on the floor with her back against the baseboard, half in the shadow of an old armchair. She was holding a doll, just the body, no head. When the door had opened, she'd pulled her knees in. She was looking at me the way you look at something when you're trying to decide whether to run. A 3-year-old. Bracing at the sound of her own front door. That image is one I have not been able to put down since. I crouched down and worked my voice into something soft. I said, "Hey baby, mama's home." She didn't come to me. But she didn't pull back further either. I stayed low and didn't move too fast, and after a moment she let me come close enough to touch her hair. That was when Marlene came out of the back hallway. She was heavy-set, wearing a housecoat, already talking before she'd fully cleared the doorframe, something about where I'd been all day, something about the dishes. Her voice carrying that particular quality of a person who has been the loudest one in a room for so long they've stopped noticing it. She looked at me the way you look at furniture you've decided you don't like. She didn't finish her sentence. She started a new one, worse. Deborah appeared behind her. Younger, louder, less focused in her cruelty, the kind that follows a lead. She had a comment about my face. Then she had a comment about the dishes. Then Mason came in from the hallway behind her and saw Avery's doll. He crossed the room and took it out of her hands. Avery reached for it. He shoved her one flat palm to the sternum and she went down on the tacky floor. He said something at her. Then he raised his foot. I caught his ankle. I didn't say anything. I just held it, not twisting, not squeezing, just held it at exactly the height it had been when he'd meant to bring it down on a 3-year-old. He lost his balance and grabbed at the air and couldn't get his foot back. He started yelling. Deborah charged at me from across the room. I caught her wrist with my free hand and applied exactly enough pressure that she stopped moving and made a sound that was more surprise than pain. I held both of them for a moment. Then I let them go. Marlene had gone to the kitchen and come back with a broom. She swung it at my shoulder. I took the handle in both hands and snapped it across my knee. The crack of it was loud enough that all 3 of them went quiet for a half-second. I set the 2 pieces on the table. I told them dinner would have rules now and I went into the kitchen. Claire had told me about the dish. Marlene's version of discipline: heavily salted dried fish cooked down until it was nearly inedible, served to Claire as a lesson whenever Marlene felt one was warranted. I found the ingredients. I made it exactly as described: too much salt, too long on the heat until the smell coming off the pan was sharp enough to sting. I set it on the table with the ceremony it apparently deserved. When Marlene reached for the pot to throw it at me, I slammed both palms flat on the table hard enough that the plates jumped and the water glasses tipped. The sound stopped her hand in midair. I told her to sit down. She sat down. I served her the fish personally, 1 spoonful at a time, with my hand on her jaw. When she decided she was done, Deborah came at me from the side and I turned and hit her once across the cheek, open hand, the full weight of my arm behind it. She hit the wall and slid down it slowly, with a look on her face like she was trying to remember something important. 5 red marks came up on her cheek before she'd even finished processing what had happened. Mason had already stopped making noise. All 3 of them went to their rooms. The house went quiet. I found Marlene's mini fridge in the back corner of her bedroom, the one Claire had mentioned, the one with the real food in it. Chicken. Yogurt. A container of rice. I took what I needed and went back to the kitchen and made Avery a proper meal and brought it to her in the front room. She looked at the plate for a moment. Then she looked at me. Then she picked up the spoon and started to eat, and halfway through the bowl she started crying quietly without drama. The way a person cries when something has been wrong for so long that the first moment of it being right is almost too much to absorb. I sat on the floor beside her and didn't say anything and put my hand on her back. She ate every bite. Kyle's shift didn't end until 11. There was still time before that particular problem came through the door. Avery had fallen asleep by 9. I put her in her bed, pulled the blanket up, and sat in the hallway outside her door until her breathing evened out. Then I went to the front room and waited. The motorcycle came down the alley at 11:20. I heard it before I saw the headlight sweep across the window, the engine cutting out, the kickstand going down. Boots on the pavement moving in that particular pattern of someone who needs to think about where their feet are landing. A string of low curses. Then the front door came open, hard kicked from outside the frame, rattling against the stop. Kyle was taller than I'd expected, with the kind of build that came from physical work and hadn't gone soft yet. He smelled of stale beer and cigarettes and something chemical underneath it, the particular smell of a casino floor that gets into fabric and stays. His eyes were red at the rims. He scanned the room, found me standing near the kitchen doorway, and his face arranged itself into something that was almost relief. He called me Claire. He said, "Where the hell had I been all day? Get him some water." I didn't move. He looked at me the way people look at a door that didn't open when they turned the handle. Then he picked up a glass off the table, a clean one I'd washed earlier, and threw it against the wall. The crash of it brought a sound from Avery's room, a short frightened cry that went up at the end like a question. I went to her. I told her it was okay, that Mama was right here, that she should close her eyes and cover her ears and it would be over soon. I tucked the blanket back around her shoulders. Then I went back out to the hallway and shut her door behind me. Kyle was in the front room telling the air what was going to happen next. He turned when he heard me and raised his hand, the same hand that had come down across a 3-year-old's face 2 nights ago. I let it get most of the way up. Then I caught his wrist. He tried to pull free. He couldn't. He swung at my face with his other hand, a drunk's haymaker, committed but slow. I moved my head 2 inches to the left and felt his knuckles graze my ear. Then I rotated his wrist inward at a specific angle that I had learned in 10 years of watching the facility staff manage patients in crisis produces a particular result very quickly. The sound it made was not loud. Kyle made a sound that was. His knees went and I let him go down. And then I hit him once across the face, open palm, all the weight of my arm behind it, 10 years of pull-ups on a steel bar behind that. His head snapped sideways. And he went into the wall and sat down hard against it. He called for his mother. He called for Deborah. Both bedroom doors stayed shut. Not one of them opened. I took him by the collar and dragged him to the bathroom. I ran the sink full of cold water. I held his head over it by the back of his hair and pushed it under. I held it there for a count. Then I pulled it back up. He gasped and choked, and said things I didn't respond to. I pushed his head under a second time. Then I let him go. He slid down the side of the cabinet to the floor with water running off his face and a look in his eyes that was something new, not anger, not bluster, just the clean, simple fact of being afraid. I left him on the bathroom floor and went to the utility closet off the kitchen. Claire had told me about Marlene's laundry arrangement, the pile that was always there, always Claire's job, always waiting. I found it. I boiled water in the largest pot I could find. Then I brought Kyle a mug of it and crouched down in front of him. I told him it was medicine. Specifically for men who put their hands on their wives. Specifically for men who put their hands on their 3-year-old daughters. He looked at the mug and then looked at me and understood exactly what was in it. He drank what I gave him. He understood that was not the end of the night, just the beginning of the part where nothing in this house was going to work the way it used to. 2 officers showed up at 8:15 the next morning, a senior one and a younger one, both in uniform. both with the expression of people who had been to houses like this before and had developed a specific kind of patience for them. Kyle had called from the bedroom sometime in the night. He met them at the door with his bruised face, arranged to do as much work as possible. I let him talk. When he finished, I put the envelope on the kitchen table and took out the contents one document at a time. 3 emergency room visits over 7 years each with an attending physician's notes. Cracked ribs, cause listed as a fall February 4 years ago. Broken nose, cause listed as a household accident 14 months ago. Concussion with brief loss of consciousness, cause listed as accidental impact 7 months ago. Photographs Claire had taken herself, dated and stored in a folder she'd kept in a zippered pocket of her winter coat. I laid them out in a row and described the previous night the same way I would describe a sequence of documented events, which is what it was. The senior officer looked at the photographs. Then he looked at Kyle's 6 feet and change, factory built, outweighing me by at least 80 pounds. Then he looked at the photographs again. He told Kyle that if a case were opened based on last night's call, it would not move in the direction Kyle was expecting. He said it quietly, the way people say things they've said many times before and learned to say without editorializing. They left a formal warning and took the paperwork details. The door closed behind them. I washed the breakfast dishes. The house stayed quiet in the way a house stays quiet when everyone in it is listening to everyone else. Marlene's room was at the end of the hall. The walls in that house were not thick. I stood in the kitchen and heard most of it, her voice low and methodical, Kyle's coming in shorter, Deborah's higher and more agitated. The plan took about 20 minutes to settle into its final shape. Chicken soup for Avery, made with care, made with love, made with the contents of something ground up fine enough to dissolve without changing the color. If I gave it to Avery, the problem solved itself. If I refused to give it to a hungry 3-year-old who was sitting right there watching the bowl, I would likely drink some myself to prove it was safe. Either way, once I was down, there was rope, and there was Marlene's phone. And there was the number for Lakeview Behavioral Health to report that a patient named Nora had been found at this address, and could someone please come collect her. It was not a stupid plan. It accounted for most of the variables. It just didn't account for the fact that I had been listening to it through the wall for the past 20 minutes. That evening Marlene set the table herself. This alone was information. She'd made a real dinner, pot roast, bread, a vegetable that had been cooked with actual attention. She asked me to sit down. She said she'd been thinking and she owed me an apology. Her voice had a warmth to it that she'd clearly had to locate from some distance. Kyle sat with his eyes on his plate. Deborah managed a version of sorry that sounded like she was reading from a card. Then Marlene brought out the soup. Small bowl separate from the rest of the meal, steam still coming off it. She set it in front of me and said she'd made it special, that Avery needed the nutrition, that she wanted to do something kind for the baby. Avery, sitting beside me, leaned toward it immediately the way hungry children do. I looked at Marlene's eyes. She was watching the bowl. I reached for it with both hands and made a soft appreciative sound. I lifted it toward Avery. Then my grip shifted just slightly, just enough, and the bowl went over the edge of the table and hit the floor, and the soup spread across the cracked linoleum in a slow, pale circle. I put my hand over my mouth. I said, "Oh no, oh I'm so sorry, how clumsy." Avery started crying at the waste of it. Marlene's smile stayed on her face for 3 full seconds after the bowl hit the floor. She knew. She had always known exactly what she was doing. And now so did I. Marlene said it was fine, these things happened, she'd make more tomorrow. Her voice was perfectly even. But her eyes had gone somewhere colder and more procedural, and I recognized that look. It meant the next attempt would not involve soup. I lay down that night with my eyes closed and my breathing slow and even, and I waited. They came at 2:17 in the morning. I heard them in the hallway, first 3 sets of footsteps moving with the exaggerated care of people trying to be quiet, which is never actually quiet. A floorboard near the door gave slightly under weight. I kept my breathing even. The door opened in increments, slow enough that the hinges didn't catch, and the hallway light came in as a thin line across the foot of the bed. Kyle came first with a coil of rope. Deborah was behind him with a roll of duct tape. Marlene came last, holding a dish towel in both hands, which I took to mean she had assigned herself the part that required the least physical effort. They arranged themselves around the bed. I kept my eyes closed. I kept breathing. The rope touched the blanket. I came off the bed in one movement, not sitting up, just up, already moving before the rope had time to settle. My right foot caught Deborah in the midsection and she went into the wall behind her and slid. The bedside lamp was ceramic base heavy and I brought it across in a short arc that connected with the side of Kyle's head before he'd registered that I was standing. He went down across the foot of the bed. Marlene had not moved yet. I put my arm across her shoulders from behind and held her there and told her quietly to be still. It took 4 minutes. Kyle was face down on the mattress, wrists and ankles secured to the bed frame with his own rope, a rag from the bathroom tied across his mouth. He could breathe. He could not do much else. Deborah was sitting against the wall holding her ribs, not going anywhere. I left Marlene standing in the doorway and walked past her into the front room. I told them Kyle had lost his mind. I said he'd found a knife somewhere and I'd barely gotten out of the room, that I needed their help, that he was saying things I'd never heard from him before. I watched their faces. The suspicion was there. These were not trusting women, but underneath it something else was moving, something that looked like appetite. 7 years of Kyle drunk and out of control, 7 years of cleaning up after him, 7 years of enabling it and absorbing the damage. The chance to walk into that room with something in their hands was not something they could reason themselves out of quickly enough. Deborah got the mop handle from the kitchen. Marlene went to the hall closet and came out with a wooden cane. I stood aside. I told them he was tied down, that they just needed to go in and hold him. I pulled Claire's phone from my pocket as they crossed the hallway. I opened the camera. I hit record. The red light came on in the dark. What happened in that room over the next 5 minutes is documented. The audio is clear. The 2 women are visible in the ambient light from the hallway, enough to identify them, enough to see what they're holding, enough to hear exactly what they say while they're saying it. Kyle was gagged and couldn't scream. The sounds he made were muffled, which seemed to encourage them. I stood in the doorway and held the phone steady. When I turned on the light, Marlene and Deborah stopped mid-motion and stood there with their weapons raised, looking at Kyle on the bed and then looking at me in the doorway. And then looking at the phone in my hand with the red light still going. I showed them the screen. Still recording. I told them I was going to make 2 calls. The first was to 911. I described the scene to the dispatcher with the same flatness I'd used with the officers that morning: a man restrained on a bed, 2 women with weapons injuries requiring medical attention. The second call was for an ambulance. I gave the address both times and hung up and carried a chair from the kitchen into the front room and sat down with my arms folded. The same senior officer arrived 12 minutes later with 2 additional units. I played him the video in its entirety. He watched it without saying anything. When it finished, he handed the phone back and turned to Marlene and Deborah, and whatever he'd been about to say he decided not to bother with. The cuffs went on outside on the front stoop under the porch light, while every neighbor on that block who was still awake found a reason to be near their front window. Kyle came out on a stretcher. The paramedic told me he had 2 fractured ribs and a laceration on the left side of his head that would need stitches. I said thank you. The ambulance left. The street went quiet. I went back inside, checked on Avery, who had slept through all of it, and sat back down in the chair. The week that followed was the quietest the house had probably been in years. Kyle was in the hospital. Marlene and Deborah were in county holding, where they would stay until Kyle either pressed charges against them or didn't. The only people in the row house were me, Avery, and Mason had watched enough of the previous 2 days from behind door frames that he had recalibrated significantly. I didn't use force with him. I gave him a different structure instead. I told him that Avery was Queen Avery and that his title in this house was Sir Mason, and that the job of a knight was to protect the queen, not frighten her. He was 5 years old, and it was the first time anyone had given him a role that required something other than staying out of the way or performing cruelty for an adult audience. He took to it with the seriousness that children apply to games that feel important. By the 3rd day he was handing Avery things before she asked. It wasn't a transformation. It was a seed, and I knew the difference, but a seed was enough. Avery ate real food every day that week. The color came back into her face incrementally, the way health returns to someone who has been running a deficit for a long time. She started sleeping through the night. On the 5th morning I found her in the kitchen, standing on her toes, trying to reach the cereal box on the 2nd shelf, both arms up, completely focused. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before I helped her. It was the first time I had seen her reach for something without checking first to see who was watching. Kyle came home on the 8th day. He came through the front door slowly, one hand on the frame, a bandage at his hairline, his left arm held at an angle that suggested the ribs were still talking to him. He saw me in the front room and stopped. He didn't say anything. He didn't meet my eyes. He went to his bedroom and closed the door. 2 days after that, Marlene and Deborah came back. Kyle had contacted the county prosecutor's office and withdrawn his complaint. He'd decided that facing me alone was worse than having them back in the house. They came in through the front door in the early evening looking like women who had spent 10 days somewhere that had taken something from them. The arrogance was gone. What replaced it was not remorse. It was a careful watchfulness. The way people get after something has demonstrated it can hurt them. They filed into the front room. All 3 of them. And then Marlene, the woman who had made my sister hand-wash the family's dirty laundry and eat food prepared as punishment, got down on her knees on the linoleum floor of her own front room. I let that sit for a moment. Then I told them the number. $380,000 for Avery, 15 years of child support calculated and paid now because I was not leaving a payment schedule behind for a compulsive gambler to honor. $120,000 for the money Claire had brought into this marriage and the 7 years of labor that had never been compensated. $120,000 for what had been done to her body, documented in 3 emergency room files currently in my jacket pocket. $520,000 total. Plus the divorce papers signed by Kyle, witnessed and notarized before I walked out the door. Marlene said there was no money like that in this house. Kyle said the same. Deborah looked at the floor. I told them where to look. Her husband had died on a construction site 15 years ago. The wrongful death settlement from the contractor's insurance carrier had been substantial. I told Marlene I knew she'd converted a portion to cash over several years. I told her it was in the utility closet behind the water heater, sealed inside a metal container wrapped in plastic. I told her I knew because Claire had noticed things over 7 years that Marlene had assumed she was too frightened to remember. Kyle and Deborah looked at Marlene. Then Kyle stood up and went to the utility closet and Deborah followed him, and 30 seconds later, there was the sound of things being moved and then a silence that meant they'd found it. What happened among the 3 of them over the next several minutes was not something I involved myself in. There was shouting. There were years of resentment that the money had been sitting on top of like a stone on a fault line, and now the stone was gone. The cash in that container was not the full $520,000, it was most of it. And the rest of it came from a second account Marlene had kept at a credit union across town. The existence of which became relevant when Deborah, who apparently knew about it, mentioned it loudly enough for me to hear from the next room. It took 3 days and it was not clean. But at the end of those 3 days, a duffel bag appeared on the front room table. I counted it. It was correct. Beside it, the divorce papers with Kyle's signature. Notarized at a UPS store 2 blocks away. He'd gone there himself the previous afternoon while Marlene and Deborah were still arguing about the credit union account. Nobody was in the room when I came downstairs and found everything in order. I put the papers in the envelope with Claire's medical records. Then I picked up Avery and her bag, which I had packed the night before, and I walked out the front door and did not look back. I took the bus back to Lakeview that same afternoon with Avery on my hip and the duffel bag in my other hand. She fell asleep against my shoulder before we reached the stop. I held her the whole ride and didn't put her down. The common room was decorated. That was the first thing I saw through the small window in the door. Paper flowers taped to the wall, a cake on the activity table. The director and 3 staff members clustered around someone standing in the center of it all, with her cheeks flushed and her shoulders back, laughing at something someone had just said. It took me a half second to recognize her. It was Claire. Standing upright. Laughing like she meant it. The director saw me come through the door and crossed the room with his hand out. He thought I was Claire coming to collect her sister. He told me that Nora had made a remarkable recovery, that the routine annual psychological evaluation conducted earlier that week had come back completely clean. Stable affect, appropriate social engagement, no signs of the anger dysregulation that had defined her file for a decade. Discharge papers were signed and ready. I stood there and let him finish. Then I looked at Claire over his shoulder, and she looked at me, and she was trying very hard not to smile in a way that would require explanation. Here is what the institution had done without knowing it. They had taken a woman who had spent 7 years being beaten into silence and given her 1 week of safety, regular meals, and the absence of fear. In that week, without any intervention at all, she had walked into a standard psychological evaluation and passed it with no flags. Her health had looked to everyone in that building like my recovery. The system had declared Nora cured. What it had actually measured was what Claire looked like when nobody was hurting her. The director handed Claire the discharge certificate. She thanked him. She thanked the staff. We walked out through the front entrance together, Claire with Avery, me with the duffel bag, and the door closed behind us into the July afternoon. One legally divorced, one legally discharged. Both of us standing on the same sidewalk in the same light for the first time in 10 years with nowhere we were required to be. That night we checked into a hotel. Clean sheets, a real bathroom, a window that opened without bars. Avery fell asleep in the middle of the bed. Claire lay down beside her and cried quietly for a long time, steadily the way you cry when the thing that was pressing on you finally lifts and your body doesn't know what to do with the space. I lay on the other side of Avery and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying. Weeks later, we had an apartment. 3rd floor south, facing more light than either of us had lived with in years. Claire got a sewing machine and started making things. Avery started at a daycare 2 blocks away and came home one afternoon with a drawing of 3 people holding hands, which she taped to the refrigerator herself. I found a used law textbook at a secondhand shop and read it on the balcony in the evenings, working through it slowly, learning the language of the thing I had navigated by instinct. One evening Claire came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from me and asked how I was. I told her I was still angry. She said I didn't have to be strong here. That this was the one place I didn't have to be anything in particular. I said I knew that. I said I was starting to actually believe it, which was different from knowing it, and she nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. So here is what I keep thinking about now that the story is over. Nora spent 10 years being written off by the system, by her parents, by everyone who looked at what she'd done at 16 and decided that was the whole of her. And when her sister needed her, she walked out of that facility and did what nobody expected her to be capable of. She was the one everyone had already given up on, and she was the only one who could do it. If you had been in that position, the one behind the door, the one everyone had already decided didn't count, what would you have done?